Grace Wren had never kissed anyone. At 18, her world revolved around tending to her ailing father and memorizing medical terms from borrowed nursing books. She didn't go to prom. She didn't post selfies. She didn't chase lover boys. But that summer her life collided with a man whose world was built on power speed and the illusion of invincibility. Lucas Vane was 28 when his car spun out of control on Highway 74. A self-made tech millionaire, Lucas had built his empire from a college dorm room and had been featured on the covers of Forbes and Wired before his 30th birthday. But none of that mattered the day his spinal cord snapped. In an instant, he went from the man who commanded a boardroom to a body that could no longer feel his own legs. 10 nurses came and went in the first year after the accident. Lucas was not just a difficult patient. He was a man unraveling from the inside out, locked inside a shell that refused to obey. He refused help, refused comfort, refused to believe that this still broken version of himself was all that was left. Then Grace walked in. She was young, too young, some said, too quiet, but there was something in the way she looked at him that was different. Not pity, not fear, just presence, stillness, like she wasn't there to fix him, but to be there whether or not he wanted her to be. 10 years later, in the golden light of an autumn afternoon, Lucas stood on his own 2 feet. In front of a garden full of wedding guests, his hand trembled slightly against the cane and every step was cautious. But his eyes never wavered as they found her across the aisle, Grace Wren in white. No longer the quiet girl who cleaned up medication spills and folded towels in silence, but a woman who had carried a love so steady, so quiet, that it outlasted grief paralysis and time itself. He took one more step forward and spoke. His voice, though soft, carried through the crowd like a whisper that had waited a decade to be heard. I spent 10 years learning how to walk again, but what I never told anyone was why. It wasn't about proving I was strong. It wasn't about revenge or legacy. It was because one day I wanted to be able to walk toward the woman who stayed when everyone else left. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. And in that moment, the quiet girl who had given her youth to care for a man no one could handle was seen not as a caretaker, not as a servant, but as the reason he rose again. This is not just a story about love. It's not even about sacrifice. It's about a girl who chose to give her heart without knowing if it would be returned. And a man who, after losing everything, realized that the only thing worth standing for was her. Before we go deeper, ask yourself this. Would you wait 10 years for someone you love if they never once said they loved you back? And if someone waited for you without asking for anything in return? What would you do when you finally found the strength to stand? Grace Wren had just turned 18 when she walked into the Vermont Hill Estate for the first time. The gravel driveway crunched under her second-hand sneakers, and the mansion that rose ahead looked like something from a magazine she had once read in a hospital waiting room. Her hands trembled, not because of the scale of the place, but because of what was waiting inside. Grace was the youngest caregiver hired by the private agency, a high school graduate with certification in basic care assistance and 2 years of home caregiving experience with her dying mother. After her mother passed away, Grace had taken full-time responsibility for her bedridden father. Her plan to become a nurse had been put on indefinite pause. Bills stacked, medication costs rose. Her dream faded slowly but surely. When the agency called about a long-term live-in care opportunity, she accepted before they finished the sentence. The man she was assigned to had once built a multi-million-dollar tech company by 25. Lucas Vane, now 28, had been charismatic, brilliant, and ruthlessly private. A car accident left him paralyzed from the chest down. Now confined to a high-end motorized wheelchair, Lucas lived in a secluded estate designed more like a fortress than a home. He had burned through caregivers in less than a year, 10 to be exact. Each left citing emotional strain, verbal abuse, and an unbearable wall of cold detachment. Grace's first day was uneventful. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Donna, barely glanced at her as she handed over a thick folder of medical routines. Lucas was not to be touched without warning. He did not want small talk. He refused eye contact. Grace stepped into his room with careful silence. He didn't look at her. He stared out the window like he had done every day for months. She placed his morning supplements next to his water glass and stood by quietly. He didn't move. Then finally he spoke. One sentence. "Do you plan to quit this week or next?" She didn't answer. She just walked forward, picked up the water glass, held it to his lips, and said gently, "We'll see." The house was breathtaking. Warm wood paneling, fireplaces in every room, huge windows that flooded the halls with light. But the master wing felt like a tomb. Lucas's suite was pristine but lifeless. Monitors hummed. Medication drawers were alphabetized. The floors shone. Grace learned the schedule quickly. Morning mobility exercises, massage to prevent muscle atrophy, assisted feeding, medication logging. Emotional support, though unspoken, was the hardest part. Grace rarely spoke during the first week. She worked with quiet efficiency, always announcing her actions, never pushing conversation. On the 5th morning, Lucas asked, "Why are you still here?" She replied simply, "Because you still are." Grace slept in a staff room with a narrow bed and a small desk. She brought with her one suitcase, 3 books on physiology, and a photograph of her mother holding her as a baby. In the quiet of the night, she reviewed old notes from high school anatomy, trying not to forget the path she had once wanted. Every other day, she wrote down how Lucas responded to treatment, even if it was just a lift of his eyebrow or a sigh. In a house where most people left in tears, she began to find rhythm. Lucas never raised his voice at her. He also never thanked her. But over time, she noticed that he started drinking the smoothies she blended instead of ignoring them. He allowed her to shave his face. He no longer flinched when she adjusted his limbs during stretches. Grace started to see the difference between silence from anger and silence from exhaustion. She had known what it looked like to watch someone disappear slowly. She had seen it in her mother, but Lucas wasn't dying. He was disappearing behind his own walls. She wasn't sure yet if she could bring him back, but she had decided quietly that she would try. In the 2nd month, something changed. Grace didn't know exactly when it started. Maybe it was the morning Lucas asked her to stay for coffee after his mobility routine, or the night she found him still awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling with a storm in his eyes. She had walked in to check his position, and instead of telling her to leave, he asked softly, "What do you think happens when you spend your whole life building something, and then you wake up and none of it matters anymore?" She didn't answer at first. Then she sat down by his bedside and said, I think maybe it means you have to find something that does. It was the first real conversation they ever had. From that night forward, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like space they both respected. Lucas never spoke about his accident, but Grace pieced things together through fragments of overheard phone calls and quiet comments. He had been driving alone. It had been raining, no alcohol, no high speed. Just a patch of oil, a moment of lost control, and then nothing. He had coded twice on the operating table. The prognosis had been grim. He was told he would never walk again. But what no one warned him about was that he would also lose the ability to feel human again. Grace didn't ask him about his past, but one day he offered it anyway. He told her he had never been good with people. He had built his company because he wanted to be left alone to create. His childhood was filled with boarding schools and nannies' parents who used money instead of time. Success had been his armor. Power was his escape. Then suddenly he had neither. She listened, and for the first time in months, Lucas looked directly at her. "Thank you for not treating me like a broken toy," he said. Grace smiled but said nothing. She had learned that the most powerful words were often the ones left unsaid. As weeks turned into months, their routine deepened. Lucas allowed her to be present during therapy sessions even when he failed. Grace didn't flinch when he cursed or threw objects out of frustration. She just calmly retrieved them and waited for the storm to pass. One afternoon, when she helped stretch his legs, her fingers brushed the edge of an old scar along his ribs. He tensed. She paused. "It looks like it hurt," she said. "It still does," he replied, "but not for the reason you think." That evening after dinner, he asked her if she believed in soulmates. The question was so unexpected, she dropped the fork she was cleaning. "I believe some people are meant to help us find the part of ourselves we've lost," she said carefully. "That's not the same as soulmates," he replied. "I know, but I think it's more important." On her 19th birthday, Lucas surprised her. Not with a gift or flowers, but with something infinitely more meaningful. When she walked into his room that morning, she found a small card on her tray of supplies. It simply said, "You stayed. Happy birthday." Her hands shook as she held it. She didn't cry in front of him, but that night, alone in her room, she let herself feel the weight of it. No one had remembered her birthday in 2 years. No one but him. One night during a thunderstorm, the power went out. Grace rushed to check on him. Lucas was calm but clearly in pain. His backup systems were malfunctioning, and the emergency generator took minutes to restart. She stayed by his side, holding his hand in the dark. "You're not scared?" he asked. "Not of the dark," she replied. "Only of not being enough." "You're more than enough," he whispered. She didn't know how to respond, so she just stayed holding his hand until the lights flickered back on. In the 5th month, something else shifted. She caught him looking at her differently, not like a nurse, not like a burdened man looks at his caregiver, but like a man seeing someone who mattered. He asked her about her childhood, about her dreams, about what she wanted if she could choose again. She told him about wanting to be a nurse, about watching her mother die slowly, about the guilt she felt for not saving her. Lucas listened, every word, and one day he said, "Grace, you were never supposed to save her. You were just supposed to love her." And that was enough. No one had ever said anything like that to her, not once, not even herself. Grace began noticing the way he watched the rain from the window. the way his eyes softened when she sang softly under her breath. He began asking her to read aloud. He started requesting her presence in the evenings, not for care but for company. They began watching films together. Grace laughed more. Lucas smiled more. One night she found an old piano in the corner of the lounge. She asked if she could try it. He nodded. Her fingers were hesitant, but remembered enough from childhood lessons. As she played, Lucas closed his eyes. When she stopped, he asked, "Why did you stop? I thought you fell asleep," she said. "I wasn't asleep. I was remembering what peace feels like." Their connection was growing, not rushed, not forced, just undeniable. But Grace knew better than to believe it meant something romantic. He was her employer. She was his caregiver. Nothing more. At least that's what she kept telling herself. But one morning she walked into his room and found him holding a pen in his right hand, struggling to write. It was the first time she'd seen him try. When she asked what he was doing, he quickly hid the paper. Nothing, just scribbling. Later, she found it in the trash. It said, "I want to stand for her." Grace folded it and kept it in her book. From that day, something grew between them, unspoken but alive. A slow burn, a quiet tether, and though neither dared to name it, it was love. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that endures. By the end of the first year, Grace had memorized the rhythm of Lucas's life, down to the second. She knew the angle at which he preferred his pillows, the way his right eyelid twitched when he was in pain, but refused to admit it, and the precise way to position his wrist brace so it wouldn't pinch his skin. She had learned to read his silence like a language, and had become fluent in the pauses between his clipped responses. But what she hadn't learned was what he was hiding behind those silences. The truth began unraveling one quiet afternoon in late October. Grace had stepped out to pick up supplies, and when she returned, she found Lucas speaking in low tones to someone on the phone. His back was to the door. He didn't hear her approach. All she caught was one line. "Just make sure it's anonymous. I don't want her to know it's from me." She said nothing. She didn't ask. But something in her shifted. That evening, an envelope arrived for Grace. Inside was a notification that she had been awarded a fully funded online nursing scholarship through a private foundation. She stared at the letter for a long time. The name on the donor line was left blank. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly who was behind it. But Lucas said nothing. He simply continued as if nothing had changed. Grace didn't confront him. Instead, she began waking earlier, studying in the hours before he stirred, typing essays in the quiet hum of the kitchen at dawn. Lucas watched her with interest, never asking but always aware. One morning, as she adjusted his knee brace, he said softly, "You're not mine to keep, are you?" She didn't look up. "I've never belonged to anyone," she said. But that night she wrote in her journal, "I think I belong to him." Not in the way a possession does, but the way a lighthouse belongs to the ocean, because it was built for it. Lucas changed too, slowly at first, but then undeniably. He asked her to bring music into the room. He allowed sunlight to pour in through the windows. He began practicing with his physical therapist instead of shutting down. Grace noticed him trying to move his fingers more often, attempting to lift a spoon on his own, even when it took 10 minutes. One day after a session, he looked at her and said, "You make me want to try." She didn't answer. She just smiled. In her heart, she was beginning to understand. Something she never thought she would. She was no longer just helping him recover. He was helping her become. For the first time in years, she believed in her dream again. Not just to become a nurse, but to be someone who mattered, who changed lives. Lucas saw it too. One evening, while she read to him from her textbook, he stopped her mid-sentence and said, "Grace, I've never told you this, but I think you're saving me in a way no one else ever has." She blinked. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said. "You're doing something no one else ever cared enough to do. You're seeing me. Truly." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying those words. She had spent so much of her life being invisible, caring for others, blending into the background, never asking to be chosen. But Lucas saw her, not just as a caregiver, not even as a friend, but as someone who mattered. The following week, Lucas began working with a new specialist in advanced neurotherapy. It was brutal. The pain was intense. The progress was slow, but he didn't quit. Grace was there through every failed lift, every tear that escaped when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, after he managed to move his foot half an inch, she clapped without thinking. He looked at her surprised, and for the first time in months he laughed. A full, real laugh. She hadn't heard that sound from him since she arrived. It made her heart feel too big for her chest. Days turned into months. The connection between them grew deeper, layered with memories, setbacks, small victories. They had created a private world, one where words weren't always necessary, where glances and gestures held more meaning than entire conversations. But Grace still didn't know what Lucas truly felt. She feared naming the bond might break it. And then came the night of the thunderstorm. The power flickered and died. Lucas's room fell into darkness, his backup monitors silent. She rushed in, flashlight shaking in her hand. He was calm, unusually so. When she knelt beside him, he whispered, "I used to be afraid of the dark, but now it's the only place where I'm not reminded of everything I've lost." She placed her hand on his and said, "Then let me be your light." He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment the air between them changed. Neither spoke of love, not yet, but it was there. Grace began noticing his attempts to protect her from the outside world. He started pushing her to finish her coursework faster. He asked if she wanted to move on, explore, live her life. She always answered the same, "I am living it." But he worried. He carried guilt like a shadow, that he was holding her back, that her loyalty came from pity. He didn't know that she had already given him her heart, fully, quietly, irrevocably. And she didn't know that he had begun rebuilding his life, not for himself, but for the day. He could tell her she was free to choose, and still hoped she would choose him. It was the 9th year when everything began to shift. Grace had now become a licensed nurse, quietly completing her degree through the scholarship that Lucas had funded but never took credit for. She still lived in the estate, still performed his care routines, but now she did so with the full qualifications she had once only dreamed of. She had her own patients part-time at a local clinic, yet always returned to Lucas in the evenings. To the outside world, she was a professional caregiver. To the household staff, she was the woman who kept him from falling apart. But to Lucas, she had become something sacred, and yet he still had not told her what she meant to him. Lucas had changed drastically. His therapists noted significant improvements in mobility, particularly in his upper body. He had regained partial movement in his right arm, and his left leg had begun to respond slightly during certain stimuli. His progress was exceptional, almost unbelievable. but the weight he carried inside remained untouched. He would sometimes stare out the window for hours, silently battling something Grace could not reach. On one particular evening, after an intense therapy session, Grace brought him tea and found him holding a letter in his lap. She asked softly, "Should I come back later?" He didn't look up. He simply said, "I'm leaving this place." She blinked. "For how long? Not for a visit," he said. "For good." Grace set down the cup slowly, unable to breathe. "What do you mean you're moving?" He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "I've bought a facility in California, state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. I'll be transferred there by the end of the month." Grace tried to stay composed. "That's wonderful. You'll get the best care. You deserve that." He finally looked up. His eyes were tired. "That's not what I want to hear." "I know," she whispered, "but it's what you need to do." He didn't speak after that, and neither did she. For the rest of the evening, they moved around each other like ghosts. When she returned to her room that night, she closed the door and cried for the first time in years. Not because he was leaving, but because he hadn't asked her to come with him. A week passed, then two. Lucas grew distant, as if already preparing himself for the separation. Grace continued her duties as usual, never missing a single moment, but every touch felt like a goodbye. On the night before his departure, he asked her to sit with him by the fire. They sat in silence for a long time before he spoke. "You saved me, Grace. In every way a person can be saved. And I know I never said it before, but I love you. I have for years." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. He continued, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to stay out of obligation. I needed to become someone worthy of you before I said it. And now that I am, I'm setting you free." Her voice broke when she asked, "And what if I didn't want to be set free?" He looked at her with eyes full of pain. "Then you would never know if your love was real or just a habit. I can't take that from you." The next morning, she helped him into the transport van without a word. She waved goodbye as the car disappeared down the driveway, clutching a letter he had left behind. In it, he wrote, "If you ever decide that your heart still wants me, I'll be waiting not as a man who needs you, but as one who chooses you." Grace left the estate 2 months later. She moved to a small town in Maine and began working full-time at a local hospital. She threw herself into her work, but every time she passed by a patient in a wheelchair, her chest tightened. Every time it rained, she remembered the sound of his laugh. Every time she stood still, she heard his voice saying, "You stayed." Life continued. She was admired, respected, often asked out by kind and successful men, but she said yes to none of them. She told herself it was because she was busy, because she wasn't ready, but deep down she knew. She had given her heart away 10 years ago, and it had never returned. Then, on a cold December afternoon, she was invited to a winter wedding by one of the hospital's senior doctors. She almost didn't go, but something nudged her. That day she wore a deep blue dress and kept to the back of the ceremony hall. The wedding was beautiful, the couple radiant, and Grace found herself smiling despite the ache in her chest, until she saw him, Lucas, standing at the back of the hall. No wheelchair, no cane, just him walking carefully but firmly toward the aisle. The entire room fell silent. The bride and groom turned in confusion as Lucas stepped forward, eyes locked on Grace. He stopped just a few feet away from her. "You told me once that I'd know if my love was real when I could walk without needing you to hold me up. I walked, and I'm still in love with you." Gasps filled the room. Grace stood frozen. He held out a small velvet box and opened it. "I don't want you to stay because you feel responsible. I want you to come home because I'm yours, if you still want me." Grace's knees weakened. She stepped forward slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. And then in front of a room full of strangers, she whispered, "I never stopped." Their embrace was quiet, reverent, not dramatic, not desperate, just two souls who had waited long enough. They returned to Vermont a week later and planned a private wedding in the garden of the estate where it all began. The vows were soft, the guests were few, but the air was thick with the kind of love that only time can grow. That evening, under the quiet warmth of string lights and the hum of cicadas, they entered their bedroom for the first time as husband and wife. Grace stood at the door, her hands trembling. Lucas turned to her, but before he could speak, she said, "I've waited 10 years to give you this, my heart, my soul. And every piece of me I've never given to anyone else. Not because I was waiting for a fairy tale, but because I was waiting for the one person I knew was worth everything." Lucas stepped forward, his voice shaking. "You don't know what this means." She placed her hand over his. "I do." That night they didn't rush. They didn't need to. There was no performance, no urgency, just a kind of closeness that only comes when two people have built their love brick by brick, over time through silence, sacrifice, and trust. The world outside faded. In that room there was only them, and every moment, every breath, every heartbeat whispered the same truth this was worth waiting for. 10 years of longing, 10 years of silence, 10 years of invisible threads pulling two hearts closer. It had led them here, not to a climax of lust or fantasy, but to a sacred moment of absolute surrender. That night, Grace gave him everything she had held sacred. And Lucas, now whole in a way he never thought possible, received her not with pride, but with awe. In the quiet aftermath as they lay together, Lucas whispered, "I didn't know a man could feel this full." Grace smiled into his chest. "You don't feel full," she said. "You feel home." The weeks after their wedding passed in a kind of quiet bliss that felt both fragile and deeply earned. Grace and Lucas lived simply, choosing to stay in the Vermont estate rather than move somewhere more modern or glamorous. The house that had once been filled with silence now echoed with music, soft conversations, and the sound of lives intertwined without effort. Grace continued her work part-time at a nearby clinic, while Lucas dedicated himself to developing a rehabilitation platform for patients recovering from neurological trauma. Together, they turned the west wing of the estate into a modest research and wellness center, offering free consultations and therapy to those who couldn't afford it. Their love was not dramatic anymore. It was rooted steady and real. They moved around each other with an intimacy only built through time, sharing glances across the garden, brushing fingertips while passing coffee cups, leaving notes in books and kitchen drawers. For most people, this would be the end of the story. But for Grace, healing was a cycle, not a finish line. And for Lucas, recovery came not only in muscles and motion, but in confronting the ghosts that still lingered behind his steady gaze. It began with a phone call. Grace answered it while Lucas was in the garden. The man on the other end introduced himself as the legal executor of Lucas's mother's estate. She had passed away 6 months prior, something Lucas had never mentioned. The man was calling to confirm whether Lucas would attend the reading of the will in Boston the following week. Grace hung up her heart, heavy with something she didn't yet understand. That evening she approached Lucas gently, told him about the call, and waited. His reaction was not anger, but a slow, quiet nod. I knew it was coming. I just didn't want to open that door again. Grace sat beside him. Why didn't you tell me she was sick? Because she wasn't. She was fine. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. She cut ties with me after the accident, said she didn't raise a man who'd live in a chair. Grace's breath caught. That's why you never spoke about her. He looked away. That's why I stopped believing people love you without conditions. Until you... The next week, Lucas agreed to go. Grace insisted on going with him. The trip was quiet, filled with old streets and cold memories. At the reading, Lucas was left a large sum of money, a painting from his childhood room, and a handwritten letter. He didn't open it. Not that day, not the next, not even after they returned. A week later, Grace found him in the study letter. Finally opened, tears silently marking his cheeks. He didn't tell her what it said, but that night he held her tighter than he ever had. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, Lucas began withdrawing, not in anger, not in bitterness, but like a man trying to solve something inside himself. Grace noticed it in the way he became quieter during meals, how he stared a little longer out the window, how he took longer walks alone. One evening after dinner, he asked, "Do you believe some wounds never close?" She replied, "I think some wounds become part of who we are, but they don't have to define how we love." He nodded, then stood up and left the room. That night, Grace found the painting from his childhood room propped against their bedroom wall. It was of a lighthouse during a storm, the same painting he had once described, from a memory during their first year together. She realized then that he had been trying to reclaim the parts of himself he had buried long ago. But some memories carry barbs. One morning, Lucas collapsed during his therapy exercises. The doctors later said it was neurological fatigue, combined with emotional strain. He recovered quickly, but Grace saw the look in his eyes. Fear. Not of dying, but of becoming helpless again, of being a burden. One evening he told her, "I don't want you to have to carry me again." And she answered, "I never carried you. We walked through it together. You were never heavy. You were home." Still the silence between them began to stretch. Not painful, just heavy. Grace could feel something building. She didn't know whether it was a question he couldn't ask or a truth he couldn't face. Then came the night he asked her the question that tore her heart in two. "If I couldn't ever walk again, would you still have married me?" She answered without hesitation, "I didn't marry your body, I married your soul." He looked at her then, and she saw it, the boy who had been left behind, the man who rebuilt himself, and the partner who still feared not being enough. Grace leaned forward, placed her hand on his chest, and whispered, "I chose you, not your recovery, not your potential, you." That night, for the first time in months, they made love not as a celebration, but as a promise, a renewal. And afterward, Lucas whispered, "I'm still healing." And Grace replied, "So am I." In the days that followed, something softened. Lucas began talking more. He showed her the letter from his mother. In it, his mother apologized for not being strong enough to accept his new life. She confessed that she thought she was protecting him by pretending he didn't exist anymore, when in truth she was protecting herself from watching her son become someone she didn't understand. "I was never ashamed of you," she wrote. "I was afraid I couldn't love you right." Grace read the letter in silence, then folded it back and placed it in Lucas's hand. "Forgiveness isn't for her," she said. "It's for you." Lucas finally let go, not loudly, not with tears, but in the way he smiled more in the mornings, in the way he touched her back gently when passing by, in the way he allowed himself to feel joy without guilt. One evening they sat on the porch as the sun set. Lucas took her hand and said, "I thought healing meant going back to who I was. But now I see it means becoming who I couldn't be before." Grace leaned into his shoulder. "And who's that man who knows love doesn't need to be earned? It just needs to be received." She smiled. "Then let me keep giving it." Their love no longer looked like recovery. It looked like peace. But just when everything felt complete, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from a young woman in New York who had been in the same accident Lucas had been in. She had followed his recovery journey through a therapist who once treated them both. In her letter, she wrote, "I've been trying to learn how to live again. Watching you and your wife taught me that healing isn't about going back. It's about choosing to go forward, even with scars." Lucas read it 3 times, then looked at Grace and said, "Maybe that's what we do now. We teach people how to walk again, even if it's not with their feet." She nodded. They decided to expand the rehab center, opening new branches in cities that lacked affordable neurological support. Together they created a movement not just about physical therapy, but emotional wholeness. The story of the girl who waited 10 years and the man who stood for her became a quiet symbol across caregiving communities and recovery groups. But to them, it was never about being an example. It was simply about love. On the anniversary of the day they first met, Lucas took Grace to the exact spot, in the garden where she had first brought him tea, where he first saw her not as a nurse but as a light. He knelt not easily, not without pain, but fully by choice. And he said, "I stood up for you once. Today I kneel, not because I'm weak, but because I want to spend the rest of my life grounded in gratitude for every day I get to love you." Grace pulled him up into her arms. "You already have," she said. "You already do." The wind carried a gentle warmth that evening as Grace stood on the porch of the Vermont estate, watching Lucas speak to a group of patients and families at the opening of their second rehabilitation center. The man beside her was not the same one she had met a decade ago. He stood taller now, not just physically, but in presence. There was no longer a shadow in his voice, no guarded edge in his eyes. Lucas had become someone whole, not because he had healed perfectly, but because he had chosen to live fully. Grace smiled as she watched a young boy in a wheelchair reach out to him. Lucas knelt beside the child and spoke softly, and Grace saw herself again. Saw the girl who had walked into this man's life when he was locked inside silence and pain, and saw how time, loyalty, and quiet love had changed everything. That night, as the last guests left and lights dimmed, Grace and Lucas returned to the room where their lives had intertwined the most, not the therapy space or the study, but their bedroom. There, under the glow of soft lamplight, they lay side by side, fingers entwined. Grace whispered, 10 years ago, I thought I was giving up my life to care for someone else. But now I see I was becoming who I was always meant to be." Lucas turned to her, his thumb brushing over the inside of her wrist where he could feel her pulse. "You didn't just stay, Grace. You loved me in silence, in waiting, in every small moment I thought I didn't deserve. You gave me a reason to rebuild. She kissed his hand. And you gave me a place to believe again. They didn't need more words. What they had was made not of grand speeches, but of quiet mornings, steady hands, and hearts that had never stopped choosing each other, even when the world told them it didn't make sense. They had broken the rules of logic, of timelines, of what people expected from a man with a broken spine and a girl with a fragile past. They had created something unshakable love that was not defined by milestones, but by meaning. The next morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, Grace sat by the window and wrote a letter to her younger self. She wrote, "You won't go to college right away. You won't fall in love in the way books and movies told you. You will be afraid, invisible, exhausted. But then you will meet a man who doesn't need saving, only someone to believe he's still worth choosing. And when you do hold on, because what you'll find won't just be a man who learns to stand again, it will be a love that teaches you how to rise too." She folded the letter and tucked it into a journal marked Year 1. Outside, Lucas was calling for her. They had patience to greet lives to impact and a story to keep writing together. Grace stepped into the morning light with a full heart. She had given her youth, her love, her patience, and her unspoken dreams. And in return, she had received a life she never thought possible. Not perfect, not easy, but wholly, completely hers. Some love stories are written in flowers and fireworks. Theirs was written in routine resilience and 10 quiet years of becoming. And perhaps that made it the most romantic story of all.